Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest A with some more historical insights. I figured that since last week I talked about one of my passions, which is books, I thought I would talk about another of my passions this week, which is country music. Because country music has a very storied history, and it is proof that America is in fact a melting pot because many cultures came together to form this one genre of music. Please join me as we take a deep dive into the melting pot that is country music and its history. So as we discussed before, first colonists brought with them ballads from the British Isles that were already very, very old. These songs told stories often of lost loves, tragic events, and, believe it or not, murders. Some were passed along in the New World relatively unchanged from generation to generation. Take, for example, the song of Barbara Allen, which was the plaintive story of unrequited love, broken heart, and two deaths, which dated all the way back to the 1600s. It was nearly 300 years old when a man named Bradley Kincaid, who had learned it from his uncle in Kentucky, first sang it on the radio. And the song received such an overwhelming response, he sang it on the radio every week for a solid year. And for many years, people had been adapting old melodies and attaching new lyrics to match their experiences in the New World. A ballad called Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie came from an old sailor's song called The Ocean Burial. The Streets of Laredo, which was about a dying Texas cowboy, took its turn from an Irish ballad called The Bard of Armagh, which was written around 1700. The Wreck of the Old 97, a ballad recounting the real story of a notorious train accident in 1903, borrowed its melody from a tune out of the 1800s called The Ship That Never Returned. However, country music also has its roots in blues. Trumpeter Wynton Marsalis once said, "In the South you have the most intense injustice, but you have people living together. You had the intensity of slavery, you have the cultures coming together. You have a depth of human tragedy in the South. You have this type of bondage in the context of freedom. You have a lot of opposites that create richness." That's where a lot of our Southern music comes from. Of course, he probably said it better than I did. His voice, I mean. Rhiannon Giddens, one of the founding members of the Grammy Award-winning Carolina Chocolate Drops, said, "The rub is people mixing. It starts going back and forth and it becomes this beautiful mixture of cultures. They had met and mingled and became this edge. But the hearts spoke musically to each other, and then somebody from up here says, 'Oh, we can't have that. You guys can't be doing this stuff together.' That's what the rub is." Author Bill C. Malone also claimed African-American style was embedded in country music from the very beginning of its commercial history. Can't conceive of this music existing without this African-American influence. But then, as people developed professionally, too often, African-Americans were forgotten. This now brings us to two very important people in the early history of country music. Would you believe me if I told you that one of the founding members of the Grand Ole Opry, the longest-running live radio show in the world, was a black man? Believe it or not, it's true. His name was DeFord Bailey. He was born on December 14th, 1899 in Smith County, Tennessee. He came from a farming family and lost his mother soon after his birth, and his Aunt Barbara and her husband Clark Odom became his foster parents. Sadly, he contracted polio at age 3, which stunted his growth, and he did not grow to more than 5 feet. But what he lacked in height, he all but made up for in talent. DeFord Bailey was the grandson of a fiddle player. He grew up in a musical family that played what he called black hillbilly music. He also learned songs in church and developed a keen ear for the music he heard around him. The chugging of trains, the baying of bloodhounds chasing foxes, and the sounds of animals on the succession of farms Clark Odom managed in Davidson and William County, Tennessee. He moved to Nashville in 1918 and spent the next 6 years working odd jobs, including stints as a houseboy, a drugstore errand boy, and an elevator operator. Meanwhile, he learned jazz, blues, and pop songs from recordings and live shows he attended in local theater. And in doing so, he became a bridge between the rural folk music of his youth and the modern world of commercial popular music. Eventually, radio would come calling, and how he got there is quite a story. A trip to Dad's Auto Parts to buy parts for his bicycle led DeFord Bailey to meeting store owner Fred Pop Exum, who was fascinated by Bailey's harmonica playing and began featuring him on radio station WDAD once Exum launched the enterprise in mid-September of 1925. And here, Bailey met harmonica player and string band leader Dr. Humphrey Bate, a country doctor from Castilian Springs, Tennessee, who began performing over Nashville's powerful WSM not long after its October 5th, 1925 debut. And within months, Bate persuaded Bailey to come with him to one night to appear on the show, which was then called the WSM Barn Dance, and then convinced station manager George D. Hay to let Bailey perform without an audition. By June 1926, Bailey was making regular appearances, and George D. Hay soon dubbed him the Harmonica Wizard. Bailey was a dazzling performer whose renditions of classic songs like Fox Chase, Pan American Blues, and other tunes became harmonica classics. For the next 15 years, Bailey remained one of the program's best loved and highest paid stars. And in 1928, DeFord Bailey would become one of the first people, actually no, the first person to ever record a record in Nashville. And during his career, something very big happened on the very show he was performing. One evening in 1927, George D. Hay spontaneously renamed the WSM Barn Dance while introducing several down-home performers immediately after a classical music program broadcast, which countered the view that there is no place in the classics for realism. They declared the upcoming program, and I quote, will present nothing but realism. It will be down to earth for the earthy. Hay introduced DeFord Bailey, whose train imitation piece, Pan American Blues, recreated the sound of L&N Railroad Express trains he remembered from his youth. And in his introduction, Hay explained, for the past hour we have been listening to music largely from the Grand Opera, but from now on we will present the Grand Ole Opry. So it was named. However, as is often the case during the early years, and even today, DeFord Bailey did face criticism and racism while on the road. Fellow performers, the Delmore brothers, told restaurant owners, if you don't feed DeFord, we can't eat here either, which shows their devotion and how popular DeFord Bailey was. Another important African American figure in the early history of country music was Leslie Riddle. He was born on June 13th, 1905 in Burnsville, North Carolina. He was a guitar player and a song collector, and with his help, the original Carter family was able to expand their catalog by learning songs gathered on the road with A.P. Carter and sharing blues guitar stylings with Mabel. Which brings us to another early family in the history of country music, and that, of course, is the Carter family. Now, the original Carter family, that is Sarah, Mabel, and A.P. Carter, definitely had an interesting history. I'll first begin with A.P. Carter. He was born in Poor Valley, now known as Mesa Springs, Virginia, in 1891 as the first of 8 children of Robert and Molly Bays Carter. His mother was nearly struck by lightning during her pregnancy. Molly, forever after, prescribed A.C.'s tremor and quaver, for which his singing will become known to that near miss. Young A.P. Carter was taken out of school early because he was made fun of for having shaky hands. So he had to find work. And he went to Richmond, Indiana to work on the railroad with the idea of earning money to buy a farm back home. But he instead came down with typhoid fever and returned to Poor Valley broke and disappointed. In 1914, he began working as a salesman for his uncle, who was selling fruit trees. And while selling them, A.P. walked over the mountain to Rich Valley to make a sale to his Aunt Susie. And as he approached the house, he heard a beautiful voice singing, and when he saw the face to whom the voice belonged, he fell in love instantly. And that girl's name was Sarah Doherty. She was born on July 21st, 1898, in Wise County, Virginia, to Sevier and Elizabeth Kilgore Doherty. Sadly, her mother died when she was just 3 years old, and her father led a nomadic existence, traveling around, staying with relatives. She was left with her uncle and aunt Milburn and Melinda Nichols in Copper Creek, Virginia, over the mountain from the Carter's ancestral home in Poor Valley. And in 1915, June 18th, to be specific, Sarah and A.P. were married, and A.P. took Sarah back to his home in Poor Valley, and a few years later, they moved into a larger house and farm up the hill in Mesa Springs, where they participated in the church choir and other local musical events. They would eventually have 3 children together, Gladys, Jeanette, and Joe. During 1925, an event happened that would add to the Carter. A gal named Mabel Addington, who was Sarah's cousin, traveled to Mesa Springs, Virginia to do a schoolhouse show with A.P. and Sarah. And on that trip, she met A.P.'s brother, Ezra, who was called Ed. They fell in love and were married the following March. Around this time, Mabel Carter began developing a unique style of guitar playing. She was the only musician with the group, and so she developed a way to play both the lead and the rhythm at the same time. This unique style of guitar playing would soon be called the Carter Scratch. She developed this method with Leslie Riddles, whose name I mentioned before. And in 1927, something would happen that would cement the Carter family and many others' names in music history forever. In late July of 1927, a man named Ralph Keir, who was a scout for Victor Records, and 2 engineers arrived in Bristol, a city straddling the Tennessee-Virginia line, to record hillbilly acts and boost Victor's old-time catalog. He recorded 10 tracks with a man named Ernest Stoneman on July 27, and he ran an ad in the Bristol News seeking more musicians. It may have been this ad that A.P. Carter saw in his local newspaper. He borrowed his brother's car and took Sarah and Mabel to try out. They recorded 6 songs over the course of 2 days and returned to Mesa Springs with $300. The Bristol session was the beginning of the Carter family's long association with the Victor executive and record scout Ralph Peer, and the beginning of their careers as professional musicians. And these sessions sessions would also launch the career of another man who became known as the father of country music. That man's name was Jimmie Rodgers. Let me tell you, this man had quite an eclectic life. Jimmie Rodgers was born on September 8, 1897 in Meridian, Mississippi. He was the youngest of three sons of Aaron and Eliza Rodgers. Sadly, his mother died when he was very young from the same disease of which he would eventually die, and Jimmie spent the next few years with relatives in southeastern Mississippi and southwestern Alabama. He eventually returned home to live with his father, Aaron Rodgers, who was a maintenance foreman on the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, who had settled with a new wife in Meridian. He developed a love for show business and entertaining at an early age. By age 13, he had twice organized traveling shows, only to be brought home by his father. First time, he stole some of his sister-in-law's bed sheets to make a crude tent. Upon his return to Meridian, he paid for the sheets with money he had made from his own show. For the second trip, he charged to his father, without his father's knowing, an expensive canvas tent. Not long after that, Aaron Rodgers found Jimmie his first railroad job as a water boy on his father's gang. A few years later, Jimmie became a brakeman on the New Orleans and Northeastern Railroad, position secured from his older brother Walter, who was a conductor on the line. And in 1924, at the age of 27, Jimmie contracted tuberculosis. This disease temporarily ended his railroad career, but gave him a chance to get back to his first love, showbiz. He organized a traveling road show and performed across the southeast until a cyclone destroyed his tent. He returned to the railroad to work as a brakeman on the east coast of Florida, but eventually his illness cost him his job. So he relocated to Tucson, Arizona, thinking the dry climate would lessen the effects of his tuberculosis. He also worked as a switchman for the Southern Pacific. The job lasted less than a year, and the Rodgers family, which by then included his wife Carrie and daughter Anita, settled back in Meridian in 1927. Later that year, Jimmie traveled to Asheville, North Carolina. In February 1927, Asheville, North Carolina's first radio station, WWNC, went on the air, and on April 18th, Jimmie Rodgers and Otis Kuykendall performed for the first time on the radio. A few months later, Jimmie recruited a group from Tennessee called the Geneva Ramblers, and they secured a weekly slot on the station as the Jimmie Rodgers Entertainers. A review in the Asheville Times remarked that Jimmie Rodgers and his entertainers managed with a type of music quite different than the station's usual material, but a kind that finds a cordial reception from a large audience. Another columnist said, "Whoever that fellow is, he either is a winner or he is going to be." And the Geneva Ramblers hail from Bristol, Tennessee, and in late July of that same year, Rodgers' bandmates got word that Ralph Peer of the Victor Talking Machine Company was coming to Bristol to record area musicians. And he and the group arrived in Bristol on August 3rd and auditioned for Ralph Peer, who agreed to record them the next day. That night, the band argued about how it should be billed on the record, which led Jimmie to declare, "All right, I'll just sing one myself." And on August the 4th, Jimmie Rodgers recorded two songs, "Sleep Baby Sleep" and "The Soldier's Sweetheart." For the recordings, he received $100. These recordings were released on October 7th, 1927, to modest success. And in November of that year, Ralph Peer recorded again at the Victor Studios in Camden, New Jersey. Four songs made it out of this session: Ben Dewberry's Final Run, Mother Was a Lady, Way Out on the Mountain, and T for Texas. And in the next 2 years, T for Texas, which was released as Blue Yodel, sold nearly 500,000 copies, which rocketed Rodgers into stardom. These recordings would follow along with such hits as In the Jailhouse Now, Hobo's Meditation, and countless others. And he was also the first person, or one of the first people, to record a hillbilly record, as it was then called, using a steel guitar, an instrument which would later become a mainstay in country music. Sadly, his career would be relatively short-lived, however, as his life would be struck short at the age of 35 when he died of tuberculosis in 1933. Jimmie Rodgers would go on to inspire countless others, including the first person to ever use an electric guitar on a country record, and that, of course, was Ernest Tubb, a man who would later go down in country music history and become synonymous with the Grand Ole Opry. And that record was Walking the Floor Over You in 1941. Interestingly, Ernest Tubb began his career as a Jimmie Rodgers protege, but sadly a tonsillectomy in 1939 took away his ability to yodel. However, I do not believe that is what flattened his voice. I believe that was because of his smoking habit. The 1940s gave way to a new era in country music, one with electrified instruments. This is when we began to see the electric steel guitar, the electric guitar, and fiddles appearing more and more in country music. Now, however, the fiddle had always been in country music from the very beginning. But we now began to see singers and full bands, and one of my personal favorites, Hank Williams, began to appear around this time. A man who definitely had a very interesting but relatively short-lived. But he did popularize what is now called the honky-tonk sound. He had worked on a variety of jobs in his early years, but he always came back to music. And in fact, he had his own radio show by the time he was 13. He began his own band during the late 30s and really began to grow in the 40s. His music did, at least. He was ineligible for the draft because of a back problem which caused lifelong pain, fueled his well-known alcohol abuse. His music publisher, Fred Rose, first met Hank in 1944 thanks to a scheduled appointment made by Hank's wife, Audrey. Originally, he was just signed on as a songwriter for A. Cuff Rose Publishing Company. He would not get to make records until 1945 when he recorded for a smaller label called Sterling. However, by 1947, Hank was recording songs for a big label, MGM. His first song on the MGM label, Moving On Over, would reach to number 4 on the U.S. Billboard charts. And in 1949, he would record a record that would later skyrocket him into superstar. The song was Lovesick Blues, and it reached to number 1 on the Billboard country charts. He was asked to become a member of the Opry and appeared on the Ryman in 1949, June of that year to be specific. He sang the song Lovesick Blues to thunderous applause, and in fact, he came back for 6 encores. However, sadly, his own career would once again be relatively short-lived as he died in 1953 at the young age of 29 from heart failure due to prolonged suffering. Short life, but a good one to be sure. He would go on to inspire countless others, much like Jimmy Rogers. Looks like I'm about gonna have to wrap things up. So if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, as Hank used to say, I'll see you again next time. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.